The first indication that something had fundamentally shifted was not a formal government announcement. It was the sudden unexplained maintenance schedule posted at 6:47 p.m. Eastern Time on the website of Enbridge's Line 5 Operations Control Center. No journalist caught it immediately. No opposition politician raised it in question period. But inside the trading floor of the Intercontinental Exchange in Atlanta, a natural gas futures analyst refreshed his screen twice before picking up a direct line to Houston. By 7:02 p.m., the price of Western Canadian Select crude had diverged from West Texas Intermediate by the widest margin in 18 months. By 7:11 p.m., a vice president at a Midwest refinery in Ohio requested an urgent conference call with federal energy contingency planners. And by 7:23 p.m., a single phrase began circulating through encrypted messages between Calgary, Tulsa, and the 30th floor of the Department of Energy in Washington. Ottawa just turned the valve. What happened next was not a shutdown, it was a review. That distinction mattered more than anyone initially understood. At 8:30 p.m., the office of Prime Minister Mark Carney released a terse, three-sentence statement. Canada remained committed to reliable energy trade. Canada remained opposed to the latest round of punitive tariffs announced by the Trump administration targeting petrochemicals and finished aluminum. And Canada would be conducting a comprehensive resilience assessment of all cross-border energy infrastructure. Comprehensive resilience assessment. Those three words sent an immediate shockwave through every integrated energy market on the continent. Because in diplomatic language, a resilience assessment is not a study, it is a warning. Within 90 minutes, the United States Department of Energy had convened an emergency technical review. Within 3 hours, the governors of Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, and Ohio had requested direct communication with Canada's ambassador. Within 5 hours, a senior trading desk analyst at Goldman Sachs reportedly summarized the situation in a single internal sentence. They are not threatening to turn off the lights. They are threatening to make the lights unreliable. Unreliability is worse than a shutdown. Shutdowns are dramatic. Shutdowns trigger emergency powers. Shutdowns create political villains. But unreliability creates something markets cannot price easily: uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads faster than fire. The numbers behind the warning were stark but rarely discussed in public. The United States imports approximately 4.3 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products from Canada every single day. That represents nearly 60% of all American crude imports. More importantly, Canadian heavy crude is not interchangeable with domestic light, sweet production. Refineries across the Midwest, from Minnesota to Texas, were specifically engineered to process that heavier grade. Retooling would take years. Retooling would cost billions. Retooling would require regulatory approvals that do not exist. Proximity had become dependency, just as it had with the bridge. But energy dependency carries a different weight. The Ambassador Bridge could be rerouted painfully over weeks. Energy infrastructure cannot. Electricity grids balance second by second. Pipeline pressures adjust slowly. Refinery intake specifications tolerate almost no variation without risking equipment damage or production disruption. When the CEO of a major Midwestern refining consortium called Ottawa at 11:15 p.m., he reportedly asked a single question: how long do we have? The answer, according to two sources familiar with the call, was not a number. It was a question in return. How long do your political leaders need to reconsider their tariff position? That exchange never appeared in any official record, but by the next morning, its meaning had traveled across every energy trading desk in North America. At 9:00 a.m., the Trump administration publicly dismissed Canada's posture as bluster from a dependent economy. A senior trade advisor told reporters that the United States could survive any temporary disruption and that Canada would hurt itself more than it hurts us. Inside the White House Situation Room, however, the tone was reportedly different. The National Security Council's energy attaché presented a slide showing that a sustained 30% reduction in Canadian heavy crude imports would force refinery utilization rates below 75% within 14 days, below 65% within 21 days, below 50% within 30 days, At 50% utilization, gasoline prices do not merely increase, they spike. At 40% utilization, regional shortages become inevitable. At 30% utilization, the Department of Defense begins receiving formal notifications about jet fuel availability for domestic bases. This was no longer a trade dispute. This was a strategic vulnerability assessment being conducted in real time. And Canada, quietly, methodically, had just become the auditor. Across the border, Carney's team maintained an almost eerie calm. No late-night social media provocations, no interviews attacking American motives, no theatrical press conferences standing beside pipelines. Instead, anonymous background briefings emphasized technical language, supply reliability frameworks, export permit review cycles, maintenance scheduling coordination. Each phrase sounded administrative. Each phrase was a dagger. Because maintenance schedules are not political, maintenance schedules are operational. And no government can order a private pipeline operator to ignore a legally required inspection without inviting immediate lawsuits, regulatory chaos, and insurance nightmare scenarios. The Trump administration understood this immediately. Publicly, they raged. Privately, they began calculating which refineries would fail first. By day two, financial markets had fully absorbed the new reality. Energy sector volatility indices spiked to levels not seen since the early months of the Russia-Ukraine war. Midwestern utility companies saw bond yields widen despite stable credit ratings. Railroad stocks that transport Canadian crude to the Gulf Coast surged briefly before analysts realized that rail could not replace pipeline capacity at scale. One hedge fund manager in Greenwich, Connecticut, summarized the new trading environment with brutal efficiency. We are no longer pricing tariffs. We are pricing the probability of industrial rationing in North America between allies. That sentence should have been impossible. It was not. The broader economic implications cascaded outward faster than most forecasters had modeled. Canadian energy exports to the United States generate approximately $150 billion annually in cross-border revenue. Disrupting that flow would certainly hurt Canada. But the asymmetry was not what Washington had assumed. Canadian oil and gas represents roughly 8% of Canada's GDP. It also represents nearly 20% of American refinery feedstock in the Midwest. The same percentage applies to electricity imports from Quebec and Ontario into New York and New England, a separate but equally fragile artery. When a senior Canadian official reportedly told a European counterpart that diversification works both ways, the observation was not smug. It was structural. Because Canada had spent the previous decade quietly expanding alternative energy export routes. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion to the Pacific Coast, LNG Canada's export terminal in Kitimat, enhanced rail capacity to Tidewater, long-term supply agreements with Asian buyers. None of these alternatives could fully replace the American market overnight, but they created something more valuable than volume. They created optionality, and optionality changes negotiating leverage completely. Washington did not have similar optionality. American refineries could not reroute to Canadian crude from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia without extensive reconfiguration. American electrical grid operators could not replace hydropower imports from Quebec with domestic natural gas without violating emissions agreements and facing years of legal challenges. American manufacturing plants in the northern tier could not simply relocate to Texas without abandoning skilled workforces and existing supply chains. Integration cuts both ways. Markets were repricing that lesson in real time. By day three, the political temperature inside Washington had become visibly erratic. President Trump reportedly alternated between demanding immediate retaliatory actions against all Canadian energy imports and questioning whether aides had miscalculated American vulnerability. Advisors split into two camps. One faction argued for aggressive counterpressure, including potential military review of cross-border energy security. Another faction warned that any escalation would accelerate precisely the diversification Canada had already begun. In the middle of this chaos, a previously obscure legal provision began circulating among trade attorneys, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. National Security-Based Tariff Authority, the same provision used to justify steel and aluminum tariffs in 2018. Some advisors reportedly proposed applying it to Canadian energy imports as retaliation. The room reportedly went silent when a career official asked a simple question. Against the country that supplies 60% of our crude imports during a global supply crisis? No one answered, because the answer was obvious. You do not weaponize national security authority against your own supply chain. That is not leverage. That is self-harm. By day 4, institutional investors had stopped waiting for political resolution. Major pension funds began rebalancing exposure to Midwestern manufacturing. Sovereign wealth funds quietly increased holdings of Canadian pipeline equities. European automakers with North American plants activated contingency logistics plans they had last updated during the pandemic. None of these moves were panics. They were adjustments. Rational, defensive, irreversible adjustments to a new baseline assumption that North American energy integration could no longer be taken for granted. The bond market understood this shift before politicians did. 10-year yield spreads between Canadian and American industrial bonds narrowed slightly, not because Canadian credit improved, but because American industrial exposure had become more uncertain. Credit default swaps on several Midwestern utility companies traded at levels inconsistent with their underlying credit ratings, a technical way of saying that markets no longer fully trusted the political environment surrounding those assets. Trust, once again, was the invisible variable, and trust was deteriorating. On day 5, a previously scheduled meeting of G7 energy ministers became an unscheduled crisis session. European officials pressed both sides for de-escalation. Japanese representatives requested assurances about broader supply chain stability. German industry groups reportedly warned that a prolonged North American energy confrontation would trigger secondary effects across transatlantic manufacturing networks. But the most revealing moment came during a private bilateral discussion between Canadian and American technical officials. According to a summary later shared with close allies, the American side asked for written assurances that no unannounced maintenance would disrupt critical supply during winter months. The Canadian side reportedly replied with a question of their own. What assurances can you provide that tariffs will not be used as coercive economic weapons against sovereign allied nations? The Americans had no immediate answer, because the treaty frameworks governing North American energy trade were never designed for this. They were designed for cooperation, for stability, for the assumption that political disputes would remain separate from physical supply. That assumption had now been broken by both sides, first by tariffs, then by the threat of infrastructure leverage. Once broken, frameworks do not heal quickly. By day 6, the economic signals had become unmistakable. Spot prices for heavy crude delivered to Midwestern refineries traded at a persistent premium to futures contracts, a classic indicator of near-term supply anxiety. Trucking companies moving refined products from the Gulf Coast northward reported surging demand as buyers sought alternatives to local supply. Storage facilities near the Minnesota-Manitoba border saw utilization rates climb toward 90% as traders positioned inventory on both sides of the line. Markets were building buffers. Buffers are expensive. Buffers signal fear. Buffers tell you that the future no longer looks like the past. Inside Ottawa, Carney's inner circle reportedly remained focused on a single objective: credibility. Every statement, every briefing, every regulatory notice reinforced the same message. Canada was not threatening to cut off energy. Canada was reviewing its own exposure. Canada was acting as a responsible economic steward. That framing was brilliant, because no one could argue against a country reviewing its own national resilience. No headline could scream, "Canada attacks America," when Canada was simply conducting maintenance and assessment. The pressure was applied not through action, but through the credible possibility of future action. That is the hardest kind of pressure to counter, because it does not demand an immediate response. It demands constant vigilance, and constant vigilance exhausts political systems faster than any ultimatum. By the end of the first week, cracks began appearing in Washington's unified front. Senate Republicans from energy importing states reportedly expressed private concerns to leadership. House Democrats from industrial districts warned of job losses if supply uncertainty persisted. Business roundtable groups that had supported tariff policies began advocating for constructive engagement, code for de-escalation. Publicly, the Trump administration doubled down. Privately, back-channel communications multiplied. And then came the moment that broke the logjam. A leaked internal memo from the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission reportedly concluded that even a moderate probability of sustained Canadian supply adjustments would justify emergency pricing interventions in wholesale electricity markets across the Northeast, not because the grid would fail, because uncertainty alone would drive bids to unmanageable levels. Uncertainty alone. That was the weapon Canada had deployed. Not a shutdown, not a crisis, just the quiet, relentless pressure of maybe. FERC had never issued such a warning about Canadian supply. Never, because Canada had never given it reason to. Now it had. Negotiations resumed formally on day 9. The setting was not Ottawa or Washington. It was a conference room inside the World Trade Organization's headquarters in Geneva. Neutral ground, carefully chosen. Carney did not attend personally. He sent his trade minister and energy minister, both of whom carried identical briefing books. The American delegation reportedly arrived expecting to negotiate tariff reductions. Instead, they were presented with a framework document titled Principles for Reliable North American Economic Infrastructure. The principles were not about tariffs, they were about process, advanced notification of trade actions, joint review mechanisms for infrastructure dependencies, dispute resolution pathways that did not involve supply chain weaponization, mutual commitments to avoid linking unrelated policy disputes to physical trade flows. In other words, Canada was not asking for a truce. Canada was asking for a new set of rules. Rules that would make what just happened impossible to repeat. The Trump administration had a choice: accept constraints on future trade leverage or continue escalating against a sophisticated, patient, and increasingly diversified northern neighbor. Accept that economic coercion had limits or discover those limits through sustained market chaos. On day 11, the White House announced a 60-day pause on new Canadian tariffs. Ottawa simultaneously announced that its infrastructure resilience assessment had concluded successfully, with no immediate operational changes required. The crisis eased, but it did not end, because in those 11 days, something irreversible had occurred. Global markets had watched two allied nations turn their own integration into a battlefield. They had watched infrastructure become leverage. They had watched uncertainty become a strategic weapon. And they had watched an administration that prided itself on strength discover that size does not always defeat position. The pipelines still flowed. The refineries still processed. The lights still stayed on. But every energy trader, every manufacturing executive, every sovereign risk analyst now understood something they had not known before. Integration creates prosperity. Integration also creates pressure points. And once pressure points are revealed, they are never fully forgotten. The trucks kept moving. The electrons kept flowing. But the assumptions beneath them, the quiet, unspoken trust that allied economies do not weaponize shared infrastructure, did not survive. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.